They told the whole town I could not handle the military and quit in silence. My family believed the son who stayed home, trusting comfortable shame over the hard truth. But walking into that federal courtroom, I did not look like a failure. I wore impeccable dress whites, shining collar insignia, and carried a file strong enough to destroy the lies they lived on for 12 years. The cruelest part was not my return, it was my proof. My name is Addison Watson. The heavy brass-handled doors of the federal courthouse in Gulfport, Mississippi, yielded to the push of my hands. I stepped inside the courtroom, and the ambient noise of the gallery died instantly. The air conditioning in the room was biting, a stark contrast to the thick, humid morning air outside, but I did not feel the chill. I was wearing my service dress whites. The fabric was immaculate, pressed to a razor edge that spoke of rigid discipline and countless hours of preparation. The gold rank insignia on my collar caught the harsh fluorescent light hanging from the high ceiling. I took a deliberate step forward. The hard heel of my military-issue shoe struck the polished marble floor. Click. I took another step. Click. The low hum of pretrial murmurs, the rustling of legal pads, the hushed whispers between attorneys, it all vanished. The room nearly stopped breathing. I kept my gaze locked forward, shoulders squared, spine completely straight. The military teaches you to control your peripheral vision, to see the battlefield without turning your head. I saw them. I saw all of them. Sitting in the second row of the public gallery, directly behind the defense table, was Marianne Watson, my mother. She was there to support her son. As I walked down the center aisle, her hands flew to her lap. She gripped the leather strap of her purse so hard that her knuckles turned bone white. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes wide and terrified, as if she were watching a dead woman walk out of a grave. She looked at my face, then at the uniform, her mind completely short-circuiting. Right next to her sat Earl Watson, my father, the former owner of a small, gritty boatyard, a man who built his entire life on the foundation of hard work and unyielding pride. He stared at the pristine white fabric covering my chest, at the rows of colorful ribbons marking years of deployments and commendations. I could read the violent, chaotic confusion twisting his weathered, sun-damaged face. He was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that simply did not fit his reality. If his daughter had cracked under the pressure, if she had disgracefully quit the Navy 12 years ago just like he was told, then who was the woman wearing the uniform of a United States naval officer walking into this federal court? At the defense table sat the architect of that very puzzle. Cole Watson, my older brother. He was the owner of a marine supply company, a lucrative enterprise that had elevated him to local royalty. Today, however, he was the primary defendant. He was being sued by the federal government for defense contract fraud, inflating invoices, and forging military records. Cole looked up from his legal notepad. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic, smooth-talking businessman vanished. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. His eyes met mine for exactly 1 second. He knew. He knew the game was over. I did not stop to greet my family. I did not offer a nod of recognition, a bitter smile, or a tear of sorrow. I walked straight past the defense table, entirely ignoring the heavy, suffocating gravity of my parents staring at my back. I reached the government witness table. The federal prosecutor looked up at me and gave a short, respectful nod. I carried a thick manila folder in my left hand. I placed it onto the solid oak surface of the table. It made a flat, heavy thud. It was the calmest, most deliberate movement I had made in over a decade. I smoothed the bottom edge of my jacket, took my assigned seat, and folded my hands on the table in front of me. I had waited for this exact morning for 4,380 days. Before the judge even banged the wooden gavel, before the clerk of court even cleared his throat to call the case number, my mere physical presence in this room had just detonated the Watson family foundation. I had shattered the grand, comforting lie they had wrapped themselves in. I was not a ghost. I was not a failure who ran away in shame. I was the prosecution's star witness, and I was holding the receipts. As the shocked silence stretched on, thick and heavy, My mind drifted away from the polished wood and cold marble of the Gulfport courthouse. The sterile smell of the room faded. My memory pulled me back east, driving down Interstate 10, back to the muddy, churning waters of the Singing River. It pulled me back to Pascagoula, Mississippi, where this entire nightmare began. Pascagoula was a town where your identity was permanently tied to the water. We lived right by the docks. Our entire world smelled of drying marine paint, pungent diesel exhaust, and the heavy, salty humidity blowing in from the Gulf of Mexico. It was a fiercely blue-collar kingdom, and my father, Earl Watson, was a minor king within it. He ran Watson Dock and Supply with grease-stained hands, a booming voice, and an absolute demand for respect. He fixed boat engines, repaired hulls, and ruled his domain with iron authority. My mother, Marianne, managed the ledgers in the back office. She balanced the books, chased down late invoices, and fiercely guarded our family reputation. To her, social standing in our small coastal town was the only currency that truly mattered. You could be struggling financially. You could be working 80 hours a week just to keep the lights on, but you could never, ever be an embarrassment. You kept your yard clean, you went to church on Sunday, and you smiled at the neighbors. Cole fit the Pascagoula mold perfectly. He was the golden boy. He had a quick, easy smile, a charming laugh, and a natural talent for talking his way into and out of anything. He was not a blatantly obvious failure. In fact, he was quite the opposite. He was highly personable. He knew how to buy a round of cheap beers for the shipyard foreman on a Friday night and make the local city councilmen feel like they were the most important people in the room. He always knew how to position himself as the most reasonable, agreeable person in any situation. He was comfortable, safe, and easily understood by my parents. I was the exact opposite. I hated the meaningless small talk. I hated the superficial Sunday dinners where we all sat around the table and pretended everything in our lives was perfect. I was principled to a fault, fiercely private, and exceptionally good at handling high-pressure situations. While Cole thrived in the chaotic, loud environment of the docks, I craved rigid structure. I loved rules, clear chains of command, and the cold, hard clarity of military discipline. I preferred reading technical manuals and organizing logistics over attending weekend bonfire parties on the beach. When I turned 18, I knew I did not want a dusty desk in the back office of Watson Dock and Supply. I wanted a life that demanded more. I announced at the dinner table one evening that I was enlisting in the United States Navy. The reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. Cole laughed out loud, shaking his head and stirring his iced tea as if I had just told a slightly amusing but ultimately ridiculous joke. He did not view me as a threat back then, just an eccentric little sister going through a dramatic phase. My mother looked worried about the optics, already calculating what she would tell the church group if I washed out. My father, however, put his fork down. He looked at me with a heavy, measuring gaze that felt like a physical weight pressing on my shoulders. He was caught between a fierce, patriotic pride and a deep, paternal skepticism. He told me that putting on a military uniform was not a game. He leaned across the table and said that if I took the oath, I better not bring shame back to his doorstep. He made it perfectly clear that once I committed, quitting was not an option. Those words became an anchor buried deep inside my brain. I did not view my enlistment as a trial run to see if I liked the military lifestyle. I viewed it as a permanent path, a one-way street that I had to walk to the very bitter end. I packed my duffel bags, left the smell of fiberglass behind, and went to basic training. Cole continued to smile and play the supportive older brother on the outside, but from the moment I left, something shifted. He began to feel marginalized. He was no longer the sole focus of the family's attention or the town's gossip. People started asking my parents how their daughter was doing in the Navy, not how their son was doing at the boatyard. He was losing his grip on the narrative. Right around the time I was preparing to leave for my first specialized training school, disaster struck at home. My father suffered a mild ischemic stroke. It was not fatal, but it severely affected his mobility and energy levels. He could no longer spend 12 hours a day crawling around engine blocks or yelling over the roar of generators. This sudden medical crisis forced my mother into a state of sheer panic. She was overwhelmed with hospital bills, physical therapy appointments, and caretaking duties. Out of sheer necessity, she handed over nearly all the administrative control of the business to Cole. He was given the keys to the kingdom. He took over the mail, the phone lines, the store's emails, and the bank accounts. That health scare provided Cole with the one thing he desperately needed to reclaim his spotlight: absolute control over the flow of information in our family. While I was stepping into a harsh, unforgiving military environment, completely unaware of the manipulation happening behind my back, Cole was building a fortress of deceit. What pushed me out of my family was not failure, but a lie fed by jealousy and the lazy failure of my own parents to verify the truth. The air in our coastal town did not just smell of salt water, it tasted like rust, evaporating diesel, and raw fiberglass resin. Growing up at the boatyard meant waking up at 5 in the morning to the harsh, grinding sound of metal scraping against metal. My father lived with black engine grease permanently wedged beneath his fingernails. He was a heavy, calloused man who spoke in the sharp, percussive rhythm of a stalling outboard motor, and he demanded that the world operate on his terms. My mother, conversely, existed in a world of crisp paper, blue ink, and neighborhood perception. She managed the ledgers in the stifling back office of Watson Dock and Supply, and she genuinely believed that as long as the accounting columns balanced and the yard looked organized from the street, the universe was in proper order. To my mother, a good name in a small town was an impenetrable shield. You could be drowning in a 30-year mortgage. You could be working 80 hours a week until your spine ached. But if you showed up to the Sunday service with a pressed collar and a warm smile, you were safe from the judgment of the world. She raised us with the unspoken rule that our family's survival depended entirely on projecting an image of quiet, hard-working reliability. My older brother understood this social currency perfectly. Cole was not a lazy deadbeat or an obvious failure, and that is exactly what made his eventual betrayal so difficult for anyone to detect. He was the golden child. He was the guy who could borrow $50 from a man he had just met at the hardware store and somehow make that man feel like he was doing him a massive favor. I remember watching him handle a furious commercial fisherman whose trawler had been sitting on our dry dock waiting for parts for 3 weeks. The fisherman was screaming, veins popping in his thick neck, threatening a massive lawsuit that would have ruined us. Cole did not yell back. He did not get defensive. He just leaned casually against a wooden piling, offered the man a cold beer from the shop cooler, and started talking in that slow, hypnotic coastal drawl. Within 15 minutes, the fisherman was laughing, shaking Cole's hand, and agreeing to wait another week. Cole possessed a terrifying, almost surgical ability to always position himself as the most reasonable, agreeable person in any room. He absorbed the town's affection like a dry sponge. My parents did not just love him, they relied on him to be the emotional shock absorber for the family. He made their lives easier, and in return, they granted him the benefit of the doubt in every single situation. I was the abrasive grit to his smooth, polished finish. I did not have his easy charm, and I fiercely refused to fake it. While he was out on Friday nights, drinking cheap beer at beach bonfires and maintaining his status as the most popular guy in the county, I was usually in my bedroom, voluntarily cataloging inventory lists for the shop or reading technical manuals. I found profound comfort in absolute rules and rigid boundaries. Human emotions, especially the tangled, unspoken resentments in my family, were messy and entirely unpredictable. A well-calibrated machine, however, was honest. If you apply the correct torque to a bolt, it holds the engine together. If you do not, the engine fails. I craved a life built on that kind of undeniable, objective metric. I wanted a structure that did not care about how well you could smile at a cocktail party or how many people liked you. The night I brought the recruitment papers home, the humidity in our small kitchen was absolutely stifling. We were eating dinner at 7 in the evening. I placed the glossy navy blue folder on the table right between the salt shaker and my mother's water glass. I looked directly at my parents and announced that I was enlisting in the United States Navy. My mother immediately reached for her cloth napkin, nervously dabbing at her mouth, her eyes darting toward the open window as if the neighbors were actively listening through the screen. She asked what people at the church would think if her only daughter went off to sleep in barracks with a bunch of rough, foul-mouthed sailors. Cole let out a short, highly dismissive laugh. He leaned back in his wooden chair, balancing precariously on the back two legs, and told me it was a cute idea, but I would be crying for my own bed within 48 hours. He smiled his signature warm smile, but his eyes were entirely hard and cold. For the first time in his life, someone else was holding the absolute center of the room's attention, and I could practically see the resentment taking root in his chest. But it was my father who truly sealed my fate. He ignored Cole's jokes and my mother's anxious fluttering. He stared down at the recruitment brochure, tracing the eagle emblem with his heavy thumb. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was a terrifying mixture of raw, patriotic pride and a rigid, almost violent expectation. He told me that putting on a military uniform was not a costume you wear to go find yourself. He leaned across the table, the smell of diesel radiating off his work shirt, and said that if I signed that paper, I belonged to the government. If I washed out, if I quit when it got hard and brought disgrace back to his front porch, I should not bother walking up the steps. Those words did not scare me. They forged me. That singular sentence became a heavy iron anchor locked deep inside my ribs. From that exact second forward, I did not view my enlistment as a trial run to see if I enjoyed the military lifestyle. It was a blood oath. It was a one-way road that I had to walk to the bitter end. No matter what it cost me, I was scheduled to ship out to the Naval Training Center in exactly 12 days. My sea bags were already packed and sitting in the corner of my bedroom. That was when the universe handed my brother the master key to my complete destruction. It happened on a Tuesday morning at roughly 9 o'clock. My father was working in the yard, trying to loosen a rusted propeller shaft on a twin-engine cruiser. He did not cry out or ask for help. He simply dropped his heavy steel wrench, grabbed the left side of his face with a trembling hand, and collapsed straight onto the hard concrete floor of the dry dock. It was a transient ischemic attack, a minor stroke. The emergency room doctors told us he would survive, but the recovery would require months of absolute rest and severe stress reduction. The towering, intimidating man who had been the booming voice of our family was suddenly confined to a living room recliner. His speech slurred, struggling to find the right words when he asked for a glass of water. The medical bills began arriving in the mail within 72 hours. My mother completely fractured under the overwhelming weight of the situation. She had spent her entire adult life managing the neat, highly predictable ledgers of a small business, but she could not mentally process the chaotic terror of failing health and the sudden threat of medical bankruptcy. She needed a savior to step in, take the reins, and handle the deafening noise of the crisis. Cole stepped into that void effortlessly, wearing his most reassuring smile. He put his arm around our mother's trembling shoulders and promised her he had absolutely everything under control. Standing in the hospital hallway, I watched her literally hand him the keys to the office filing cabinets. Over the next few days, she gave him the administrative passwords to the business bank accounts, the login credentials for the family email, and the sole authority to sort and sign for the daily mail delivery. She surrendered the entire communication infrastructure of our family directly to him. I was too intensely focused on memorizing the sailor's creed and preparing my mind for the brutal shock of basic training to realize what was truly happening in the background. I genuinely thought my brother was just stepping up to run the boatyard while our father recovered. I had absolutely no idea that as I hugged my crying mother goodbye and walked out the front door to serve my country, Cole was quietly locking the iron gates of communication behind me. The health crisis had given him absolute, unchecked control over the flow of information in our home, setting the perfect stage for a lie that would erase me from their lives. Basic training was a brutal, systematic dismantling of the individual, designed to strip away civilian habits and rebuild you into a functioning component of a massive machine. I thrived in it. When my company commanders screamed orders at 0400 hours, I did not hear abuse. I heard clear, unambiguous expectations. After surviving the physical exhaustion of those first 8 weeks, the Navy routed me into specialized training for logistics and procurement. It was there, sitting in sterile, brightly lit classrooms, that I found my absolute calling. The military supply chain was a universe governed by strict federal acquisition regulations, national stock numbers, and unyielding accountability. Every single item, from a $1 million radar component down to a 10-cent brass fitting, had a paper trail. It required a level of meticulous pressure and procedural discipline that perfectly matched the architecture of my brain. I was exceptionally good at it. During those initial months of training, I tried desperately to maintain the bridge to my past. Every Sunday afternoon, when we were granted limited phone privileges, I would stand in a long line of recruits, clutching a prepaid calling card, waiting to dial the familiar 10-digit number of my childhood home. Week after week, the phone would ring 4 times before clicking over to the answering machine. I would leave brief, breathless messages, detailing my test scores and my upcoming graduation dates. In the evenings, sitting on my tightly made bunk, I wrote letters on cheap, lined paper. I paid 39 cents for stamps and dropped them into the blue outgoing mail slots. At first, I received a few generic, sparsely worded replies from my mother, but then the responses began to thin out, stretching from weeks into months until the silence became absolute. Initially, I constructed elaborate, highly rational excuses for them. I told myself that my father's medical recovery was consuming all their energy. I convinced myself that my mother was drowning in the complicated ledgers of the boatyard, and that the sheer volume of daily tasks left no room for letters. I gave them a massive amount of grace, assuming the quiet was a byproduct of their overwhelming circumstances, not a deliberate erasure. The devastating reality was entirely different. My brother had systematically severed every communication artery connecting me to my family. He did not just stop answering the phone when he saw my area code. He actively intercepted the rural mail carrier before the truck even reached our mailbox. He gathered my handwritten letters, the envelopes bearing military postmarks, and threw them directly into the heavy steel burn barrel behind the shop. He logged into the family email accounts and changed the passwords, locking my mother out of the digital world entirely. Cole needed a narrative to explain my lack of presence and my sudden silence, and he crafted one with terrifying precision. He sat my fragile, exhausted mother down in the kitchen and told her that the physical and mental demands of the military had broken me. He claimed that I had washed out of the program weeks ago, that I was profoundly ashamed of my failure, and that I was currently drifting, too embarrassed to face the family. He told her I wanted absolute silence. To solidify his lie, Cole utilized the heavy-duty scanners and printers in the boatyard office. He downloaded generic military administrative forms from the internet and altered the text to look like an official notice of entry-level separation. He took old, disjointed text messages I had sent him years prior, frustrated texts from high school saying things like I was exhausted, or that I just wanted to quit whatever menial task I was doing, and spliced them together. He presented these fabricated documents and manipulated digital screenshots to my parents as undeniable proof that I lacked the fundamental grit to continue. He weaponized my mother's complete ignorance of military bureaucracy. She had no idea what a real discharge paper looked like, and she had no reason to suspect her charming, supportive son would ever forge one. When I finally completed my technical schooling, I was granted a brief, 96-hour liberty before I had to report to my first permanent duty station. I booked a commercial flight back to the Gulf Coast. Traveling in a formal uniform for a quick, personal weekend trip was highly discouraged. So I wore simple civilian clothes, a faded blue cotton shirt, a pair of dark denim jeans, and comfortable canvas sneakers. I took a local taxi from the regional airport, watching the familiar, salt-weathered pine trees blur past the window. I paid the driver $20, grabbed my canvas duffel bag, and walked up the gravel driveway. The heavy humidity felt exactly the same. The smell of the marsh was unchanged. I walked up the 3 wooden steps to the front porch and turned the brass knob. The door was locked. I knocked twice, a solid, familiar rhythm. A minute later, the door clicked open. My mother stood in the threshold. She was wearing her floral kitchen apron, her hands dusted with white baking flour. The moment she saw my face, her body physically recoiled. There was no sudden gasp of joy. There was no tearful embrace. Her eyes dropped immediately to my faded blue shirt and my denim jeans. The look that washed over her face was not explosive anger. It was a sickening, suffocating mixture of profound disappointment and deep, uncomfortable evasion. She looked at me as if I were a stray animal that had dragged something rotting onto her clean porch. She took a half step backward, actively creating physical distance between us. Before I could even form the words to ask what was wrong, my father appeared in the narrow hallway behind her. He was leaning heavily on his aluminum medical cane, dragging his left leg slightly as he moved. He stopped and stared directly at my civilian clothing. In his mind, damaged by the stroke and expertly manipulated by my brother, my lack of a military uniform was the final, irrefutable confirmation of every single lie Cole had told them. The visual evidence perfectly matched the fabricated story. I dropped my duffel bag onto the wooden floorboards. I took a breath, ready to tell them about my orders, about my top-class ranking, about the guided missile destroyer I was assigned to join in 3 days. My father raised his thick, calloused right hand. It was a sharp, chopping motion that demanded absolute silence. He did not yell. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, thick with contempt. He told me that he had warned me about bringing shame to his doorstep. He said he did not want to hear whatever pathetic excuses I had rehearsed on the airplane, and that he would not allow me to stand on his property and lie to his face just to save my own bruised ego. I looked past his shoulder. Standing near the entrance to the kitchen, half hidden in the shadows of the hallway, was Cole. His arms were crossed over his chest. His face was arranged into a mask of perfectly calibrated, sympathetic sorrow, but his eyes were locked onto mine with a cold, triumphant stillness. In that frozen fraction of a second, the mechanics of the entire betrayal clicked into perfect clarity in my mind. I saw the intercepted letters. I saw the manipulated narrative. I realized that the harder I tried to explain my presence, the more my parents would view me as a desperate failure trying to cover up a shameful discharge. My father's pride could not handle a complicated truth, and my mother's fragile nerves could only handle the easy comfort of the son standing right next to her. They were actively choosing to believe the person safely inside the house over the person who was actually serving the country. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and beg them to call my commanding officer for verification. I did not engage in a melodramatic, tear-soaked screaming match on the front lawn. The realization that my family preferred a comfortable lie over my actual existence killed something very soft and very vulnerable inside my chest. It was a cold, clinical death. I reached down, grabbed the thick canvas strap of my duffel bag, and hoisted it back onto my shoulder. I looked at my mother's evasive eyes, my father's disgusted scowl, and my brother's silent victory. I turned around and walked down the wooden steps. The heavy front door closed behind me with a solid, resonant click, followed immediately by the sharp slide of the metal deadbolt. That was the exact night I stopped trying to win back my family's affection with desperate words and lost letters. Walking down the dark gravel road away from the boatyard, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would not argue. I would not explain. I decided that one day, the truth would not be something I had to beg them to hear. The truth would be something that would have to walk into the room and destroy them itself. When the heavy wooden door locked behind me in Pascagoula, I did not shatter on the front porch. I did not allow myself the luxury of a breakdown. Instead, I shed my skin. The soft, vulnerable tissue of a daughter desperately seeking parental validation burned away entirely during the long, silent walk back to the highway. In its place, I grew a thick, impenetrable armor forged from federal regulations, naval operating procedures, and cold, hard data. I realized very quickly that if you do not have a home to return to, you must build one out of the immediate work in front of you. I poured every single ounce of my remaining humanity, every stray emotional impulse that threatened to derail my focus, directly into the rigid structure of the military supply chain. The Navy did not care about my bruised heart or my family drama. It only cared if I could execute my orders 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I learned to live entirely by the manual, because a manual does not lie. It does not hold resentment, and it absolutely never chooses favorites. 4 years into my service, I was stationed at Blue Water Readiness Command. It was a massive, sprawling logistics hub responsible for outfitting, supplying, and maintaining fleet operations across multiple global theaters. The environment was a chaotic, high-stakes storm of requisition forms, urgent supply requests, and massive civilian defense contracts. While other junior officers frequently drowned in the sheer, overwhelming volume of the paperwork, I found utter tranquility in the endless rows of data. I developed an uncanny, almost aggressive ability to read heavy procurement files at a terrifying speed. I could scan a 600-page shipping manifest and instantly smell when the mathematics did not align. I became the officer who found a $75,000 discrepancy buried on page 42 of a routine aviation maintenance contract. When a critical supply chain completely collapsed and senior officers were losing their tempers over missing turbine blades, I was the one sitting perfectly still in a room full of shouting men, quietly tracing the serial numbers back to the exact commercial loading dock where the error had occurred. I did not panic when the people around me panicked. Panic was an emotion, and I had successfully excised emotion from my daily operational protocols. My unnatural composure caught the immediate attention of Commander Leah Mercer. She was a deeply intimidating, highly decorated woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and a terrifying reputation for ending careers over sloppy accounting. She did not suffer fools. She despised laziness, and she possessed a gaze that could strip the paint off a bulkhead. Commander Mercer became the very first person in the military to look past my quiet, disciplined exterior and see the absolute apex predator underneath. She recognized that I was not just passively checking boxes on a compliance sheet, I was actively hunting. I had an innate, visceral instinct for tracking down the truth, for tracing every single taxpayer dollar back to its ultimate point of origin. Commander Mercer took me under her wing, pulling me out of the standard rotation and placing me directly under her command. She assigned me the most complex, convoluted, and financially dangerous contracting files the base had to offer, deliberately throwing me into the deep end to see if I would drown. I did not drown. I learned to breathe underwater. I did not build my new life through sweeping romances, comfortable friendships, or cinematic moments of battlefield glory. There were no fairy tales to be found in the acquisitions department. I built my career in windowless, fluorescent-lit rooms, surviving on stale black coffee and 4 hours of sleep. I built it by auditing secure supply routes, strictly verifying complex delivery receipts, and blocking fraudulent charges before they could morph into catastrophic congressional scandals. I earned my promotions by being the most fiercely hated person in the room during vendor negotiations. I routinely infuriated civilian contractors because I absolutely refused to look the other way or blindly sign off on inflated invoices just to keep the bureaucratic workflow moving smoothly. If a local contractor tried to charge the federal government $300 for a $20 titanium wrench, I rejected the entire supply pallet, froze their accounts, and flagged their parent company for a comprehensive federal review. I was cold, precise, and entirely unyielding. I became a human firewall. Yet, despite the titanium walls I had constructed around my psyche, a phantom limb of my past still ached in the quiet moments. For the first 5 years of my career, I maintained a solitary, agonizing ritual. On major holidays, I would force myself to write a letter home. I would sit at my gray metal desk on the 25th of December or the fourth Thursday in November and draft a single, factual page detailing my recent promotions, my current duty stations, and the undeniable proof of my continued existence. I bought stamps and mailed those envelopes back to the Gulf Coast. I never received a single word in response. Eventually, The physical act of dropping those letters into the outgoing mail stopped feeling like a vessel for hope and slowly turned into a quiet ritual of unnecessary strain. But I never stopped writing them. I just stopped sending them into the void. Instead, I began keeping strict carbon copies of every single piece of personal correspondence I drafted. I bought a heavy fireproof lockbox and filed the copies away, organized chronologically by year, month, and day. I did not keep them because I was drowning in sentimental nostalgia or because I could not let go of the past. I kept them because my entire professional life revolved around the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of maintaining accurate records. I needed a paper trail for my own soul. I needed undeniable physical proof that I had reached out, that I had tried to bridge the gap, and that my narrative was the objective truth. I was actively creating a permanent, auditable ledger of my own life to combat the fiction my family had so easily swallowed. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had never disappeared. I had merely been erased from their jurisdiction, and I refused to let that erasure go undocumented. This stark dichotomy defined every waking moment of my existence. To the men and women I served alongside at Blue Water Readiness Command, I was a highly respected officer, the unbreakable anchor of the logistics team. I was the person you trusted with a $500 million quarterly budget because my integrity was considered absolute and unquestionable. But back in Mississippi, in the minds of the people who actually shared my blood, I was still the cowardly ghost of a pathetic failure. I was a cautionary tale told in hushed tones over Sunday dinners. The massive, glaring discrepancy between who I actually was and who my family believed me to be became a dark, quiet engine humming constantly beneath my ribs. It fueled my relentless obsession with accuracy. It drove me to work 90-hour weeks without complaint. It pushed me to aggressively climb higher and higher up the chain of command. To my peers, my ambition looked like standard military dedication. They had no idea it was actually a highly refined survival mechanism. I wanted more authority. I wanted access to deeper, more heavily restricted tiers of the defense contracting world. I systematically dismantled every professional obstacle in my path, earning elevated security clearances that allowed me to audit the massive, complex civilian supply networks feeding the military machine. I did not fully realize it at the time, but my relentless upward trajectory was putting me on a very specific, highly dangerous collision course. The higher I climbed into the administrative stratosphere of the United States Navy, the closer I was getting to the exact type of regional vendor files that might, one day, carry the unmistakable fingerprints of my own buried past. It was nearing 2 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, nearly 11 years to the day after I walked away from that gravel driveway. The base was utterly silent. I sat alone in a sterile, temperature-controlled vault on the 3rd floor of the Regional Command Center, bathed in the pale blue light of 3 secure monitors. My task was supposed to be a standard, low-level compliance review of secondary subcontractors operating within the Gulf Coast naval sector. It was the kind of dry, monotonous cross-referencing that usually put junior officers to sleep. I was scanning through a dense, 85-page quarterly expenditure report for coastal defense maintenance when a specific string of characters on line 42 brought my cursor to an abrupt, dead halt. The vendor listed was Gulf Meridian Logistics. The name alone was a minor red flag. It sounded like a generic, off-the-shelf corporate shell, the kind constructed to sound vaguely official without actually meaning anything. But it was the geographical region that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. They were operating out of Jackson County, Mississippi. I leaned closer to the monitor, the hum of the server rack suddenly fading into the background. I told myself it was just a geographical coincidence. The military contracted with thousands of maritime supply outfits along the southern coast. I highlighted the vendor code and ran it through the master database to pull up their foundational charter and primary operational addresses. The database took exactly 4 seconds to return the results. The registered physical address was a commercial warehouse situated less than 3 miles from the waterfront where I grew up. But it was the secondary financial guarantor listed in the fine print of their initial bonding application that made my lungs stop working. Watson Dock and Supply. I did not gasp. I did not slam my fist against the metal desk. A profound, absolute stillness washed over me, dropping my internal temperature to absolute zero. I methodically pulled up the corresponding invoice history for Gulf Meridian Logistics over the past 48 months. The anomalies were not subtle, they were arrogant. The company was billing the federal government for high-grade maritime equipment at staggering markups. They were invoicing heavy-duty bilge pumps at $12,000 a unit, when the standard market rate hovered around $800. They were claiming hazard pay for transit routes that did not exist, and inflating logistical overhead by nearly 40% on every single purchase order. But inflated invoices were just the baseline symptom of a much deeper disease. I bypassed the financial ledgers and dug directly into the raw capability certifications they had submitted to win these federal bids in the first place. To secure Department of Defense contracts, civilian companies must prove they possess the operational capacity, the security clearances, and the technical expertise required to handle sensitive military logistics. I opened a scanned document of their core capability statement. The document was heavily padded with generic corporate jargon, but the executive summary heavily emphasized a unique competitive advantage. The proposal boasted of direct, internal military procurement expertise. They claimed their supply chain was optimized by an active-duty logistics specialist who served as a silent, consulting partner, ensuring absolute compliance with naval acquisition standards. I scrolled down to the signature block on page 19. My breath caught in my throat, freezing into a solid block of ice. Listed under the title of Senior Procurement Advisor was a name A. Watson. Right beside the typed name was a digital signature. I stared at the looping, jagged cursive. It was not a perfect forgery, but it was close enough to pass a casual visual inspection by a distracted federal clerk. It was my signature. It was the exact way I signed my name on high school permission slips and early bank applications before I tightened my handwriting in the military. This was no longer a simple case of a brother who wanted his sister out of the house. The betrayal mutated, growing fangs right in front of my eyes. Cole had not just stolen my family. He had not just convinced my parents that I was a coward who quit when the pressure got too high. He had taken my actual military identity, the very career he had mocked and actively tried to destroy, and weaponized it into a highly lucrative commercial asset. He had used my name, my rank, and my supposed expertise to legitimize a fraudulent empire. I spent the next 6 hours pulling every piece of digital thread connected to Gulf Meridian Logistics. I bypassed my standard security protocols and accessed the deep-tier investigative tools usually reserved for the Inspector General's internal watchdogs. I mapped the entire network. The connections blossomed across my screens like a venomous spiderweb. I found a maze of shell companies routing profits through regional banks, washing the inflated government checks before filtering the clean money back into the accounts of Watson Dock and Supply. I pulled the digital metadata from the submitted capability statements. The embedded printer identification tags matched the exact make and model of the heavy-duty commercial scanner sitting in the back office of my family's boatyard. I cross-referenced the submission timestamps of the fraudulent capability statements with local public records. The dates perfectly aligned with the exact year Cole initiated a massive, multi-million-dollar expansion of the family business, buying up adjacent waterfront properties and upgrading all the dry dock equipment. The pieces locked together with sickening precision. My brother had needed capital to build his kingdom. Banks require collateral and guaranteed revenue streams for commercial loans of that magnitude. Cole had found his guaranteed revenue stream in the form of federal defense contracts, and he had secured those contracts by selling the government a phantom. He had kept my parents completely in the dark, leveraging their profound ignorance of military procedure. He likely told them the expansion was the result of his own brilliant networking and hard work. Meanwhile, in the shadows, he was using the ghost of my career to open doors he never could have breached on his own. The initial lie, the fabricated story that I had washed out of basic training, had not been born purely out of spontaneous sibling jealousy. It was a calculated, necessary foundation. Cole had to erase the real Addison Watson from the family narrative so he could freely invent a new A. Watson on paper. If I had remained in contact with my parents, if I had been coming home for holidays in my uniform, I would have eventually seen the paperwork. I would have noticed the shell companies. The lie was the moral infrastructure he required to operate his fraud without detection. I leaned back in my chair, the sterile blue light reflecting off my eyes. The office was still perfectly quiet, but a violent storm was breaking inside my head. The realization was sharp, cold, and utterly devastating. My brother had not simply pushed me out to be the favorite child. He had pushed me out so he could cannibalize my life. Every single contract he had secured, every dollar he had funneled into his bank accounts, every piece of respect he had garnered in that coastal town over the last decade was built on a stolen foundation. Cole Watson had built his entire fortune and secured his status as the pride of our family. Using the exact military service he told my parents I was too weak to finish. I reported my findings to the Inspector General's office at exactly 0800 hours the following morning, because the primary target of this massive fraud was my own blood relative. Standard federal administrative protocol dictated my immediate removal from the active investigation to prevent any potential conflict of interest. I was officially firewalled from making any command decisions or signing any warrants regarding Gulf Meridian logistics. However, the federal agents assigned to the case quickly realized they were drowning in a suffocating ocean of maritime procurement jargon. They understood financial crimes, but they did not understand the highly specific, convoluted mechanics of naval supply chains. They desperately needed a translator to decode the fraud. I became their unofficial architect, the person who mapped the underlying operational logic of the scam from the sidelines. While I was barred from leading the charge, I sat in sterile, soundproof briefing rooms and watched the authorities dismantle my brother's operation piece by piece. I showed the investigators exactly which loopholes Cole had exploited. He had aggressively targeted expedited procurement protocols, the specific type of fast-tracked contracts designed for urgent fleet readiness and coastal disaster relief. Knowing those channels often bypassed standard, lengthy physical inspections. The investigators traced the digital breadcrumbs back to a freelance document specialist operating out of a dingy strip mall in Biloxi. This man was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. He was a desperate, underpaid graphic designer who forged corporate documents for quick cash. Under federal interrogation, he completely flipped within 20 minutes. He confessed that Cole had provided him with a massive physical file of my old personal data. My brother had systematically raided the boatyard's dusty filing cabinets, pulling my high school scholarship applications, my old Social Security card copies, and my dependent information from our parents' joint tax returns filed over a decade ago. Cole used that raw, stolen data to fabricate a heavily detailed, completely fictitious naval advisory profile, to make the entire package visually airtight. The Biloxi specialist registered a spoofed web domain. It looked remarkably similar to a legitimate Department of Defense server address, off by only a single transposed letter. It was a cheap digital parlor trick, but it was incredibly effective. When civilian government clerks ran a cursory background check on the submitted documents, the domain looked perfectly official. The investigative team discovered something even more sickening. Years ago, when Cole initially needed to convince our mother that I was sending disgraceful, defeated messages about quitting basic training, he had used that exact same spoofed email system. He had manufactured a digital paper trail that looked terrifyingly real to a woman who still balanced her daily checkbook with a ballpoint pen. He built his corporate fraud using the exact same tools he used to destroy my place in the family. The financial auditors uncovered the most devastating layer of the betrayal on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a thick stack of asset forfeiture summaries when my eyes caught a specific parcel number attached to a massive commercial loan guarantee. It was not a waterfront warehouse. It was not a dry dock facility. It was a residential address. It was the single-story house with the wraparound porch and the squeaky screen door where I had grown up. Cole had not just stolen my identity to secure his initial line of credit. He had actively leveraged our childhood home. He had convinced our aging parents to sign over the property deed as collateral for a multi-million-dollar commercial expansion loan. I could clearly picture the exact pitch he gave them. He likely sat at the worn kitchen table, flashed his effortless, golden smile, and promised them it was a completely zero-risk maneuver. He told them the business expansion was backed by airtight, highly lucrative military contracts. On paper, my parents genuinely believed they were simply co-signing a triumphant new chapter for the family enterprise. In reality, they were standing on a floor constructed entirely of rotting wood, holding a lit match. If the federal government pulled those fraudulent contracts and demanded restitution, the regional bank would foreclose on the boatyard, the business accounts, and the house. My parents would lose absolutely everything they had worked for their entire lives, all because they trusted their perfect son. The United States attorney handling the prosecution recognized my unique value immediately. He knew I was not just a passive victim of aggravated identity theft. I was an active-duty logistics officer who could sit on a witness stand and expertly dismantle the complex defense contracting process for a civilian jury. I could explain exactly how the bidding chain was manipulated, why the capability certificates were statistically impossible, and how the entire enterprise was a calculated, predatory fiction. A jury might eventually get bored by endless financial spreadsheets, but they would deeply understand the absolute betrayal of a stolen identity explained by a sister in a crisp uniform. Commander Leah Mercer called me into her private office to discuss the impending trial. She stood by her large window, looking out over the gray naval shipyard, and she did not sugarcoat the brutal reality of the situation. She told me that if I officially agreed to testify as the prosecution's star witness, my entire personal history would be dragged into the unforgiving, blinding light of a federal courtroom. Every painful family dynamic, every old psychological wound, and every quiet humiliation would become permanent public record. The aggressive defense attorneys would attempt to tear my credibility apart by highlighting my long estrangement from my family. She offered me a clean, quiet exit. She said she could authorize my immediate transfer to a high-level command post in San Diego by the end of the week. I could step away entirely, let the federal prosecutors handle my brother using only the paper evidence, and keep my hard-earned peace of mind completely intact. I looked at the heavy brass nameplate resting on her desk. I thought about the thousands of solitary hours I had spent building a life out of rigid discipline when my heart had nowhere else to go. I thought about the gravel driveway I had walked down alone, carrying a canvas duffel bag and a shattered sense of belonging. I looked up at my commander and told her I was staying, but I made a distinct, highly tactical choice. I absolutely refused to pick up the phone and call Pascagoula. I would not give my family a courtesy heads up. I would not give my fragile mother the opportunity to cry and beg me to drop the charges to save the family name. And I would certainly not give my brother the crucial time he needed to formulate a legal defense against my actual existence. I wanted the truth to detonate in the exact arena where Cole falsely believed he held absolute control in a room strictly governed by sworn oaths, federal judges, and permanent, undeniable records. The federal grand jury ultimately returned a sprawling, 40-count indictment against Gulf Meridian Logistics. The official subpoenas were issued on a crisp Tuesday morning, delivered directly to the boatyard by federal marshals wearing dark windbreakers. And the absolute second the thick stack of court papers landed in his hands, Cole realized he was completely trapped, prompting him to immediately construct one final, desperate lie to keep our parents standing firmly by his side. When the federal marshals finally descended upon the boatyard to serve the massive 40-count indictment, my brother did not panic. Nor did he pack a bag and flee. He simply pivoted. He fell back on the single greatest weapon he possessed, his terrifying ability to construct an alternate reality that perfectly catered to the emotional needs of his audience. He sat my parents down at the worn oak table in their kitchen, poured them both a fresh cup of coffee, and delivered an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. He told them that his incredibly successful marine supply company had been aggressively targeted by a corrupt female logistics officer operating deep within the regional naval command structure. He claimed this unnamed officer had demanded illicit kickbacks, asking for a flat 20% cut of his gross federal revenue in exchange for approving his supply chains. When he righteously refused to play her dirty game and refused to compromise the ethical integrity of Watson Dock and Supply, she launched a massive, coordinated vendetta against him. He spun a highly detailed tale of an overreaching, vindictive government bureaucracy, using obscure financial technicalities to crush a hardworking, honest family business. He deliberately omitted my name from his story. He painted a vivid picture where he was the noble, protective victim, standing tall to shield his elderly parents from the ruthless federal machine. My mother and father swallowed the story completely, without a single moment of critical hesitation. They had spent more than a decade living comfortably inside the fiction that their only daughter had quit the military in absolute disgrace. In their minds, they were already tragic figures who had suffered a great family embarrassment. The idea that their successful golden son was now being actively persecuted by a corrupt federal system fit perfectly into their blue-collar worldview. It was immensely easier for them to believe that the United States government was fundamentally evil than to entertain the terrifying possibility that the son sitting across the table was a predatory fraud. They rallied behind him instantly, completely oblivious to the fact that the corrupt female officer he was describing was the very daughter they had erased. While they were busy preparing a unified family front, I was standing alone in my quarters, preparing my own defense. I was meticulously assembling my service dress whites. I ran a hot iron over the thick, heavy fabric, pressing the trousers until every single crease was sharp enough to cut glass. I attached my ribbons one by one, measuring the exact spacing with a brass ruler. The National Defense Service Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Expeditionary Medal, the Navy Commendation ribbons. Each colorful bar was a physical, undeniable rebuttal to the 12 years of lies they had spoken about me. Every brass button I polished, every gold rank insignia I pinned to my collar, served as a silent, devastating indictment of their failure to believe in me. I was not merely getting dressed for a court appearance. I was building an armor made entirely of absolute truth, preparing a visual prosecution that required no spoken words. Commander Leah Mercer called me into her office late that afternoon. She looked at the preliminary witness list on her desk, her sharp eyes studying my steady hands. She cautioned me that the collateral damage of my testimony would be completely uncontainable. She warned that the sudden, violent psychological shock to my parents seeing me walk to the witness stand in full uniform after believing I was a cowardly failure for over 10 years could fundamentally break their minds. I looked back at her without a single trace of hesitation. I kept my voice entirely flat. I told her that the shock she was so worried about should have happened 3,000 days ago. I was merely delivering the delayed invoice for their willful ignorance. My absolute certainty, however, was severely tested by a newly discovered piece of evidence later that evening. The federal prosecutors handed me a sealed plastic evidence bag containing items seized during the raid on the boatyard. The official inventory log indicated these specific items were pulled directly from the heavy steel floor safe located in the back office, the exact safe my parents used to store their property deeds, life insurance policies, and critical tax documents. Inside the clear plastic bag were 5 envelopes. They were slightly yellowed around the edges, bearing my distinct handwriting and official military postmarks from my first 3 duty stations. They were the letters I had sent home during those agonizing early years. They had not been intercepted at the rural mailbox and immediately burned in the scrapyard incinerator as I had originally assumed. They had been opened. They had been read, and then they had been deliberately tucked away beneath stacks of maritime insurance policies in a safe that both of my parents had the combination to access. I sat alone in the sterile conference room, staring through the plastic at the faded ink of my own name. A profound, suffocating realization washed over me, altering the entire landscape of my grief. The deepest, most agonizing source of pain was no longer the fact that Cole had actively lied to them. The true horror was the undeniable evidence that my parents had possessed the physical opportunity to question his narrative. My mother filed accounting papers in that safe every single quarter. My father pulled equipment titles from that safe. At some point over the last 10 years, They had to have seen those envelopes. They had to have recognized the military return addresses. But rather than confront the terrifying discrepancy between Cole's story and the physical proof sitting right in their own hands, they chose to close the heavy steel door. They chose to look away. They actively chose the comfortable, easy fiction provided by the son who stayed home over the complicated, demanding reality of the daughter who left. They were not entirely innocent victims of a criminal mastermind. They were passive accomplices in my erasure. They let me disappear because it was easier than fighting for the truth. The night before the trial officially began, I returned to my sparse apartment. I did not pour a glass of whiskey to numb the revelation. I did not cry into my hands. I did not fall to my knees and pray for the universe to grant me a softer landing or a sudden wave of familial forgiveness. I sat perfectly upright at my small wooden desk under the harsh, white glare of a single reading lamp. I opened my legal binder and systematically arranged my notes, my timelines, and my sworn statements. I straightened the facts of my life exactly the way a trauma surgeon straightens a shattered spine before fusing it permanently back together. I removed every single trace of lingering emotion, every ounce of childhood grief, until absolutely nothing remained but cold, undeniable chronological data. The following morning presented a contrast so stark it felt almost violently poetic. 70 miles away, in the thick, humid coastal air of Pascagoula, my mother and father were quietly loading into the cab of my father's heavy pickup truck. They were driving west toward the federal courthouse, fueled by a misguided sense of fierce parental duty, completely convinced they were going to save their golden boy from a corrupt system. Meanwhile, I stood on the polished marble steps of the federal building in Gulfport. I adjusted the pristine white collar of my uniform, took a slow, measured breath of the cool morning air, and stepped through the heavy glass doors. I was not walking in to argue with them. I was walking in to permanently terminate my brother's right to tell my story. My parents arrived at the federal building early that morning. They walked into the courtroom with the rigid, defiant posture of righteous defenders. They took their seats on the heavy wooden benches directly behind the defense table, acting as a unified, impenetrable front. In their minds, they were stepping into a battlefield to protect their brilliant, hard-working son from a cold, faceless, and entirely corrupt government system. They were fully prepared to endure complex legal jargon and aggressive federal prosecutors. They had absolutely no defense prepared for the weapon the government actually brought through the heavy oak doors. When I crossed the threshold into the gallery, the ambient noise in the room died instantly. I wore my service dress whites. The fabric was immaculate, carrying the stiff, undeniable weight of federal authority. Marianne stopped breathing. I watched her chest freeze beneath her floral blouse. She gripped the strap of her leather purse so hard, her knuckles turned completely white. She looked exactly like a woman paralyzed by the sudden appearance of a ghost rising from the floorboards. Earl did not just look at me. He analyzed me with a desperate, frantic intensity. He was trying to find a flaw in the presentation that would prove this was an elaborate hallucination or a cruel theatrical trick. He looked at my polished black Oxfords, tracing his eyes up the perfectly aligned row of gold buttons on my jacket, and finally locked onto the heavy brass rank insignia pinned to my collar. The longer he stared, the more his grip on reality slipped away. The comforting narrative he had slept soundly on for over a decade. The story of a weak daughter who could not handle the pressure and quit in silence was completely disintegrating under the harsh fluorescent lights of a federal building. Every single ribbon on my chest was a direct, irrefutable contradiction to the lie he had chosen to believe. Cole did not collapse into a puddle of panic. He was far too seasoned a manipulator for a public breakdown. He sat perfectly still at the defense table, his hands folded neatly over a legal pad, his jaw muscles tight beneath his skin. But when his eyes flicked away from his highly paid defense attorney and met mine, the charade fractured. It was a fraction of a second, a silent, violent collision of gazes across the polished wood, but it was enough. He saw the cold certainty in my posture. He knew the battlefield was no longer his cozy living room in Pascagoula. He knew the rules of the game had fundamentally changed, and he no longer controlled the narrative. The trial opened not with emotional theatrics, but with the suffocating weight of documentary evidence. The lead federal prosecutor stood up and began methodically disassembling my brother's empire. The government projected massive financial spreadsheets onto a large screen positioned directly next to the jury box. They tracked the complex flow of stolen capital. They showed the court how shell companies funneled hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars through obscure regional banking channels before depositing them straight into the corporate accounts of Watson Dock and Supply. The prosecutor displayed the doctored capability statements side by side with the legitimate originals, highlighting the crude digital alterations and forged signatures. Then, the specific terminology began to fall like rhythmic hammer strikes. The prosecutor did not just talk about vague corporate overbilling. He spoke about a calculated, predatory deception involving stolen valor and identity theft. He pointed directly to the defense table and explained how the defendant had secured these lucrative contracts by falsely claiming exclusive high-level military backing. Every single time the prosecutor said the phrase fabricated military connection or read the title Advisor A, Watson out loud to the jury, my mother and father physically flinched. They would slowly, almost involuntarily, turn their heads to look at me sitting stoically at the prosecution table. I did not look back at them. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the judge, my posture perfectly straight. My absolute, unwavering silence in that room was infinitely sharper and more punishing than any screaming accusation I could have thrown at them. The truth was speaking for me through federal exhibits and bank routing numbers. At exactly noon, the presiding judge struck his wooden gavel and called for a mandatory 2-hour lunch recess. The gallery erupted into a low hum of shifting bodies and hushed conversations. I stood up, gathered my legal binders, and walked out into the wide marble corridor. I stood near a towering concrete pillar, waiting for the federal agents to escort me to a secure briefing room. I heard the hesitant, shuffling footsteps approach from behind before I actually saw them. I turned around. Marianne was standing 3 feet away. Her face was completely drained of color, her eyes red and wide with an agonizing mix of terror and desperate hope. She clutched her leather purse against her stomach like a physical shield against the reality crashing down around her. Her voice shook violently when she finally forced the words through her tight throat. She asked me a single, short, heartbreaking question. She asked if I was still in the Navy. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. And I did not offer a single ounce of comforting warmth to soften the blow. I simply told her that I never left. Earl stood right behind her, leaning heavily on his aluminum medical cane. He heard my cold, factual answer, and I watched the physical weight of that sentence crush whatever remaining pride he held. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The massive, complex machinery of my brother's deception was finally clicking into perfect, devastating place inside his aging mind. He was beginning to comprehend the sheer, terrifying scope of the manipulation. To maintain a lie of this magnitude for so many years, Cole had not merely tricked a few federal clerks or forged a few generic corporate signatures to win a bid. He had looked his own father and mother directly in the eyes, day after day, year after year, and fed them a continuous, deliberate poison. He had used their unquestioning love and blind loyalty as a convenient shield for his federal crimes. Earl realized in that hallway that the United States government was not the only entity his son had defrauded. Yet, as devastating as that brief hallway confrontation was, the vast majority of the criminal enterprise remained buried beneath the surface. The prosecution had only laid out the baseline financial fraud during the morning session. They had successfully proven the fake invoices, the circular money trails, and the doctored federal bids. But Cole was still holding a massive, catastrophic secret close to his chest. The jury had not yet seen the specific property records and loan guarantees. My parents did not yet know that he had not merely borrowed my name and rank to inflate his corporate resume. He had actively weaponized my supposed disappearance to systematically strip away my legal standing within our family. He had used the void he created to completely seize the foundational assets and property rights of the family business, putting everything they owned on the chopping block. My parents walked back into the courtroom for the afternoon session looking like hollow shells. Their absolute, unwavering faith in their golden son was fractured beyond repair, replaced by a suffocating dread. But the true reckoning had not even started. Day 1 was only enough to shock them. Day 2 would be the day they learned exactly what they had paid. The gavel struck the block at exactly 4 o'clock. The first day of the trial concluded, leaving the courtroom saturated with a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. I packed my legal pads into my leather briefcase, the sharp snaps echoing in the thinning gallery. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped out into the expansive marble corridor of the courthouse. The late afternoon sun filtered through the high arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the polished floor. I was walking toward the bank of elevators when a hand caught the heavy fabric of my uniform sleeve. I stopped, turning slowly. It was Cole. His defense attorney was nowhere in sight. He had deliberately slipped away to corner me. The effortless, golden boy charisma he wore like a second skin was fraying severely at the edges, but he was desperately trying to hold the mask in place. He looked around the empty stretch of the hallway, lowering his voice to an urgent, conspiratorial whisper. He tried to sell me one final, pathetic narrative. He leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and raw panic. He told me that the federal prosecutors were blowing a minor administrative oversight completely out of proportion. He insisted that the forged capability statements and the phantom advisor roles were merely aggressive business tactics, just procedures pushed too far. He smiled a tight, desperate smile, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. He actually had the audacity to say that a few copied signatures were just a harmless shortcut in a rigged government system. I did not raise my voice. I did not pull my arm away defensively. I simply let the silence stretch until his artificial smile began to physically tremble. I looked directly into his eyes and asked one single, razor-sharp question. When exactly did you start lying to them about me quitting the Navy? Was it purely out of spite in the beginning, or did you already know my identity could become your personal cash cow? The question stripped the remaining layers of his disguise entirely. His jaw clenched so hard, a muscle twitched violently beneath his cheek. The sympathetic, misunderstood businessman vanished, leaving only the resentful, hollow core of the brother I grew up with. He did not deny it. He looked at the marble floor and admitted that it started as pure jealousy. I had taken the oxygen out of the room by enlisting. But a few years later, when he was desperate for capital to expand the yard and hit a brick wall with the regional banks, the lie mutated. The federal defense contracts were sitting right there, a massive pool of money strictly reserved for military-affiliated vendors. My stolen identity was simply too lucrative, too perfectly positioned, for him to stop using it. He did not realize that our parents had pushed through the courtroom doors and were standing less than 10 feet behind him. Marianne let out a choked, ragged sound. It was the sound of a woman physically breaking in half. Cole spun around, the color draining from his face as he realized his private confession had just met its audience. My mother stepped forward, her hands shaking violently. During the afternoon session, the prosecutors had entered a specific piece of evidence into the public record, the 5 sealed envelopes found hidden in the back office safe. The envelopes I had mailed from my first 3 duty stations. She looked at Cole, then looked at me. Her eyes flooded with a decade of misplaced grief. She asked me, her voice fracturing into sharp pieces, if I had really kept writing to them. I told her the exact dates I mailed those letters. I told her the exact color of the ink. I explained that I had not vanished out of shame. I explained that her golden son had intercepted the mail carrier, taken the letters directly from the box, and buried them beneath maritime insurance policies so she would never see them. She covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The reality that the silence she had mourned for over a decade was entirely manufactured by the man standing next to her caused her knees to physically buckle. She had spent 12 years believing she had lost a daughter to the crushing pressure of the military, when in truth, She had lost her to the greed of her own son. But the most devastating blow did not come from my mother's tears. It came from my father. Earl stepped heavily into the space between us, leaning his entire weight onto his aluminum cane. He looked older than he had just a few hours ago, his face hollowed out by the sheer gravity of his own complicity. He looked at me, his eyes entirely devoid of their usual stubborn pride, and confessed a truth that cut deeper than stolen mail or forged signatures. He told me about the massive business expansion Cole initiated 7 years ago. Cole had needed significant leverage to secure the commercial loans. He had brought a stack of legal documents to the kitchen table one evening. Among them was the deed to the old waterfront dockyard, the original piece of property that anchored our family to Pascagoula. It was supposed to be a shared inheritance, the foundational bedrock of our name. Earl swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. He confessed that Cole had actively persuaded him to sign over the entire legal interest of that property exclusively to the newly formed corporate entity. Cole had looked his father in the eyes and sworn that I had permanently abandoned the family. Cole told him that I despised our blue-collar life, that I had run away, and that I wanted absolutely nothing to do with the family dirt. Based entirely on that vicious lie, my father had picked up a pen and signed away my birthright. The magnitude of the theft was finally laid bare. Cole had not merely stolen my emotional standing within the household. He had executed a systematic, legal erasure of my existence. He had weaponized my absence to sever every single financial and legal tie I had to my own bloodline, consolidating all the family assets under his absolute control. My parents stood in the hallway, completely shattered, waiting for me to scream at them, waiting for the righteous, explosive anger they absolutely deserved. Instead, I opened my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a thick-bound legal folder with a bright red tab. I did not offer them forgiveness, and I did not offer them tears. I operated entirely on the cold procedural logic that had kept me alive for 12 years. I looked at Earl and told him that I had not spent the last decade blindly trusting the universe to balance the scales. I informed them that 48 hours prior to this federal criminal trial, my retained attorneys had officially filed a parallel civil lawsuit in the state jurisdiction. The suit was a targeted injunction to permanently freeze all asset transfers, property deeds, and corporate holdings tied to the boatyard and Gulf Meridian logistics. I was legally moving to nullify every single property transfer Earl had signed, explicitly on the grounds of fraudulent inducement and aggravated identity theft. My parents stared at the legal folder in my hands, completely paralyzed by a secondary wave of shock. They suddenly realized the true nature of the woman standing before them. I had not returned to this coastal town to beg for their belated belief. I had not come to salvage a broken family dynamic. I had arrived as a fully armed adversary who had meticulously mapped every single one of Cole's vulnerabilities and systematically blocked every possible avenue of escape. I slid the folder back into my briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. The sound was as sharp and final as a gunshot in the quiet hallway. I looked at the three of them, the brother who sold my life, the mother who chose not to look for me, and the father who signed my legacy away. I advised them to get a good night of sleep. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, the federal prosecutors would call me to the witness stand. I would raise my right hand, swear an oath to the court, and begin my official testimony. And the words I would speak under penalty of perjury would not merely end my brother's fraudulent maritime empire and send him to a federal penitentiary. My testimony, backed by the civil injunction I held in my briefcase, would be the sole determining factor in whether the regional bank swept in and seized the very bricks my parents slept in, or if my own legal maneuvers would be the only thing left to save the house they had so carelessly risked. The bailiff called my name at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. I stood up from the prosecution table, the heavy fabric of my service dress whites shifting smoothly around my shoulders. I walked toward the witness stand. The entire gallery fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Even the aggressive defense attorneys stopped shuffling their legal pads. I raised my right hand, placing my left on the worn leather cover of the Bible. The clerk asked if I swore to tell the truth. I looked directly at the judge and said I did. My voice was perfectly flat, devoid of any trembling anger or theatrical sorrow. The lead prosecutor began the direct examination. He asked me to state my name and occupation for the permanent record. I detailed my current rank and my position at Blue Water Readiness Command. Then, he asked me to walk the jury through my entire military service timeline. For the next 2 hours, I dismantled my brother's fabricated narrative brick by brick. I listed every single deployment, every specialized logistics school I attended, and every command I served under over the past 12 years. I provided the exact dates and the specific geographical coordinates of my duty stations. The jury listened with rapt attention as I established an undeniable, heavily documented reality I had never washed out. I had never quit, and I had certainly never been sitting in a civilian office acting as a private procurement advisor for Gulf Meridian Logistics. The prosecutor then handed me the thick binder of capability certificates and vendor invoices submitted by my brother's company. I opened the folder to the signature pages. I explained to the court exactly why the signatures bearing my name were statistical and physical impossibilities. I pointed to a specific defense contract dated the 14th of November, year 6 of my service. I informed the jury that on that exact date, I was physically stationed aboard a naval vessel conducting maneuvers in the Philippine Sea, completely under communication blackout protocols. I had no access to civilian email, let alone the ability to authorize a regional supply contract in Mississippi. I walked them through the rigid, multi-layered digital security clearances required for legitimate military procurement, proving that the sloppy forged documents Cole used would never pass a genuine federal audit. The government then delivered the final, fatal blow. The prosecutor called a digital forensics expert to the stand to corroborate my testimony. They displayed the data extracted from the boatyard. The jury saw the access logs, the IP addresses, and the exact timestamps from the heavy commercial scanner sitting in my parents' back office. They traced the spoofed military email domain directly to the credit card registered in Cole's name. But the most damning piece of evidence was the commercial mortgage file. The prosecutor projected the property deed transfer onto the screen, showing exactly how my brother had leveraged our childhood home to secure his fraudulent empire. He had used the fake military contracts, backed by my stolen identity, to convince the bank that the loan was a zero-risk investment. He had pushed his own parents onto the edge of total financial ruin just to fund his ambition. Cole tried to maintain his composed, misunderstood businessman facade for a few more minutes, but the sheer weight of the absolute, irrefutable data finally crushed him. His high-priced defense attorney attempted a weak cross-examination, trying to suggest I was a disgruntled sister seeking revenge, but the paper trail was completely impenetrable. During a sidebar conference, Cole physically slumped in his chair. He looked at the floor, his shoulders caving inward. He realized the game was entirely over. He had started this massive deception fueled by petty sibling jealousy, expanded it through unchecked corporate ambition, and ultimately doomed himself by arrogantly believing that our parents would never be smart enough or brave enough to verify the truth. The judge did not hesitate. Given the overwhelming evidence of federal contracting fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft, the court issued an immediate, heavy ruling. The judge ordered the absolute freezing of all financial assets connected to Gulf Meridian Logistics and Watson Dock and Supply. He mandated massive financial restitution to the Department of Defense, paving the clear road for a lengthy federal prison sentence for my brother. Furthermore, the judge officially invalidated every single corporate document, loan guarantee, and capability certificate that bore my forged signature. That invalidation triggered the ultimate devastating payback I had prepared. Because the federal court officially recognized the signatures as fraudulent, the parallel civil lawsuit I had filed was immediately granted preliminary acceptance. My legal maneuver successfully severed the commercial liability from the residential property. The regional bank was legally blocked from foreclosing on the house my parents slept in. However, the exact same civil action permanently stripped Cole of his controlling interest in the maritime business and the waterfront dockyard. He lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom in a single afternoon. When the court finally adjourned, I walked out into the echoing marble hallway. My parents were waiting near the heavy wooden doors. They looked completely hollowed out, carrying the posture of people who had just survived a catastrophic earthquake only to realize they had built their house on a fault line. Marianne stepped forward. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She offered a desperate, trembling apology. She told me she was so incredibly sorry for believing the lies, for not looking harder, for letting me go. Earl stood beside her, leaning heavily on his cane. He did not make excuses this time. He looked at my uniform, then looked at the floor, and admitted that his own stubborn pride had blinded him. He confessed that it had been easier to accept the comfortable shame of a failed daughter than to do the hard work of verifying the truth. For the very first time in my entire life, they were not demanding obedience or projecting their expectations onto me. They were standing before me, completely broken, asking for my forgiveness. I did not step forward to embrace them. I did not offer them a beautiful, cinematic reconciliation. My voice remained as calm and steady as it had been on the witness stand. I looked at the two people who gave me life and told them that the truth had saved their home today. I told them they would not lose the roof over their heads because of my legal intervention. But I also told them that no amount of tears and no federal court ruling could ever return the 12 years of my life they had so casually thrown away. I turned my back to them and walked toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the warm, fading sunlight of the Gulf Coast afternoon. I walked down the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, the crisp white fabric of my uniform standing out against the gray stone. I did not look over my shoulder. The profound weight I had carried for over a decade was finally gone. I knew, with absolute certainty, that my revenge was not completed when my brother's empire collapsed in that courtroom. The true closure arrived when my parents were finally forced to look directly at the horrifying reality of their own choices. They did not lose their daughter to the harsh demands of the United States Navy. They lost me because they simply chose to trust the wrong person. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.